Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Method Ministries. I'm your host, Lucas Curcio, and today I have the honor of being here with Rusty Reno. He wrote a couple of books, but I just read his book, Return of the Strong Gods, and I want to talk about that. It was an excellent book. And Rusty, I just want to say thank you for being here and taking your time out for this discussion.
Great. It's good to be with you. Thank you for
Definitely.
reading the book.
Yeah, my pleasure. Do you want to give like a little intro or tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I am the editor of First Things magazine, which is America's leading journal on religion, culture, and public life, or a monthly magazine, and a website that has fresh material every day. And kind of our job is to be a religiously informed commentary on the political scene, but not just the political scene, but also the cultural scene. And my background is in theology. I did a PhD in theology at Yale University in the late 1980s
Hmm.
and taught theology and ethics at a Jesuit university in Omaha, Nebraska named Creighton University. And so my formation, my intellectual interests, my education, my advanced education has all been at this kind of intersection of Christianity and culture. And
Wow.
First Things magazine is just basically, it was founded by Richard John Newhouse, a Lutheran pastor, became a Catholic priest. It was founded really a very like-minded man. It was founded as a forum for people like you and me to bounce ideas off the public, bounce ideas off each other.
Okay, wow. And you are a Roman Catholic, correct?
Yes, I was raised an Episcopalian and entered the Catholic Church in 2004, so 20 years ago.
Oh wow! So you went from Anglicanism to Rome, or as people say, go home, or going home.
It was definitely, as I tell people, the Catholic Church has been better than I thought it would be.
Yeah, and then your magazine, you said, is kind of like a way to try to bridge the gap, I guess, between other sects of Christianity.
Yes, it's ecumenical. I think it's fair to say that it's Catholic heavy. Some of the major players, contributors, editors are Catholic, but we have a strong bench of Protestant writers. Paul Kingsnorth gave our recent Erasmus lecture, and he's a kind of a notable writer, a recent convert to Eastern Orthodoxy from
Okay.
from paganism.
Oh wow.
And I recommend his really fabulous essay he wrote for us a couple of years ago called "The Cross and the Machine: Story of His Conversion." Very powerful.
Interesting title.
Well, the machine is his metaphor for the soulless, technocratic world that we've created in the late modern era,
Okay, got
and
it.
its relentless pursuit of the maximization of utility at the expense of almost all spiritual goods.
Hmm. Well, speaking of titles, your title is very interesting as well. I got to say, I didn't know. I've heard this book a little bit during early this year, but then what made me tune into it was a lot of talk about post-war consensus. So I didn't know that your book spoke much about that, which is one of the things that I would like to talk about. But what drove the title of this book, The Return of the Strong Gods? Because maybe people would look at that and they would think, oh, is this a polytheism?
Exactly. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for strong loves, objects of our strong loves. So the strong gods have the power to evoke from us love and loyalty. And it doesn't, the return of the strong god doesn't mean the return of Zeus or Jupiter or Thor or anything else, but it really means that we've been through a long season that has emphasized the weakening of our passions and the weakening of our loyalties, the weakening of truth, and that long season is now coming to an end. And the problems facing our society are stem from this project of weakening.
Hmm.
And so human nature, St. John Paul II used to say that we're made to love, we're made to give ourselves away to another in love. And so the human heart seeks to find things to rest in. St. Augustine, our heart is restless and finds its rest in God.
Hmm.
There are also natural things: love of place, love of nation, love of family, um, love of truth. So there are many natural loves that we're attracted to. And they've
Okay.
been the post-war era has emphasized a weakening of those loves. That's what I call the open society consensus or the post-war consensus.
Okay. Were you one of the first ones to use this term, or did you learn this from somebody else? The phrase post-war consensus.
I mean, I formulated it, and it's really funny because I taught, as I said, from 1990 to 2010. In 1990, I could say post-war to a for college freshman,
Hmm.
and they wouldn't hesitate. By the time I got to 2010, I'd say post-war, and I could see the kind of quizzical look on their faces, like which war? And see, I was born in 1959, and
Okay.
so post-war just automatically means post-World War II. And
Got it.
there, I mean, I'm not the first one to observe that the American society coming out of World War II developed a distinctive social and cultural and political consensus. Uh,
Okay.
but, you know, what I do in the book is I try to outline it to give its main features, this post-war consensus, which, as I say, is really concerned to protect us from the return of Hitler,
Hmm.
from the return of authoritarianism, totalitarianism. It's characterized by what I call these anti imperatives: anti racism, anti colonialism, anti authoritarianism, anti totalitarianism, and that these have all the moral prestige in the post war consensus. And as I say, I think by the time you get to 2024, the problems facing our country are not authoritarian masses ready to oppress, but rather it's the feeling of disintegration. There's a wag who said, gosh, about a decade ago, it was, I think, a European sociologist. People are not in the streets in the searching for a final solution. This is a reference to the Holocaust.
Hmm.
Rather, they're searching for the final sale. And so, commercial society, the marketplace, um, the, the mass culture, that these really have formed us at such a profound level as to atomize and disintegrate traditional forms of life.
Okay. And just to put that in a nutshell, so would you say the main thesis of your book is that due to this post-war consensus, it's maybe a wrong interpretation or wrong lessons learned from World War II that actually weaken our natural loves that are actually good to us? Would that be fair?
Um, is it a mistake? I mean, 1945 was a long, long time ago. And, listeners need to realize that from 1914 to 1945, these were decades of disaster,
Yeah.
millions killed in futile, inconclusive battles in trench warfare on the Western Front. And then societies in turmoil. In Germany, um, in Bavaria, there was a communist government that was established in Munich briefly in 1919. And then there was basically a civil war in parts of Germany as the army veterans formed a kind of paramilitary organization called the Freikorps, and it battled against communist paramilitary organizations. And then, of course, the Depression, and then the Spanish Civil War, which was seen as a precursor to the battle of communism versus fascism, and then World War II, and millions more killed, atomic weapons used, genocide at Auschwitz, um, uh, uh, direct targeting of civilian populations and bombing campaigns. It really was. It knocked the stuffing out of Western civilization
Hmm.
those years. And was it a mistake to try to respond by lowering the temperature and decreasing the passions that had become so destructive? Maybe not. I mean, I think I probably would have signed on to that project and
Hmm.
1950. But it's gone on for too long and it went too far. That's my
Hmm.
thesis in the book. What might have made sense in 1950 uh, has become a flesh eating agenda that has left us really, as I say, atomized and kind of swimming in a infinitely liquid world.
And then I guess on a street level, we would be able to see this with like, regarding just a simple fact. We're coming off of Trump's election. Anybody who voted for him, anybody who supported him, not just in 2024, but in 2020, 2016, we were called fascists, we were called Nazis. Like, would that be fair to say? Like, basically, like, it's the left using World War II in a way also to say, hey, unless you get in line with us, you're equivalent. You're equivalent to these fascists in the Third Reich. Would that be as fair as well?
That it's To me that's a sign of the decadence and the the fact that the post-war consensus could become dysfunctional.
Hmm.
I mean, you can dislike Donald Trump. You can vote against him. You can think his policies are misguided, his personality unappealing, his vices far greater than his virtues. Perfectly reasonable. But to think that he is the second coming of Adolf Hitler, only a person imbued with the post-war consensus, and it's become a kind of template. I have heard the name Hitler more in the last 8 years than in my entire life before
Hmm.
him. So I'm 64 years old, and in the 50 years prior, maybe I'm conscious for 40 years prior to 2016, I heard the talk of fascism and Hitler far, far, far less frequently than I have in the last. So it's a kind of paradox. The farther away we get from the events, the more powerful their hold is on our imaginations. Again, I think that's a sign of how dysfunctional the post-war consensus has become.
Well, and I do think that's a good way to see what you're getting at because. So, well, you know what? First of all, let me ask you this. Would you say that the strong gods, like, are you interpreting that through a natural law approach, like as in natural affections? Would you say?
But there's supernatural as well. I mean, I think
Okay.
our love of God is obviously the strongest of all strong. It ought to be our strongest love. And in that sense, the true God is the true strong God.
Yeah. Amen.
There's that great passage um, in the Gospels where you know uh, the uh, the the brigand or the burglar comes and he binds
Oh
the
yeah.
the
Strong man.
the householder, and but then a stronger man comes, and of course that's Christ, um, and he can break the power of the devil to bind us in this regime of sin and death. So Christ, God in Christ is the true strong God. All the other gods, if I use scare quotes, are just a metaphor for, as you point out, Lucas, these natural loves. Now, Jesus says to us we have to be prepared to hate our mother and our father, our brother and our sister, in order to follow Him. So the New Testament is clear. Our love of God is the only supreme love,
Hmm.
and that if our other loves come into conflict, we must sacrifice them in order to follow Christ. And so, love of nation, love of family, these natural loves, are subordinate to the higher love, the supernatural love of God. But that said, it doesn't. Jesus did not intend for us to neglect these natural loves. Um,
Got it.
he didn't. He didn't say when he said, "Let the dead bury the dead." Again, he was saying that it could be that to follow him, we have to forsake the natural duty to care, the corporal work of mercy of burying the dead. But Jesus was not saying we don't have a duty to honor the dead. Uh, he's just making these claims about what has priority. We should always be spiritually prepared to sacrifice our natural loves for the sake of our supernatural love of God.
So it sounds like what you're getting at is, and you quote that in the book, Thomas Aquinas's quote, "Grace doesn't destroy nature," right? Like, is that what you're getting at?
Mhm.
Yeah. Well,
Grace perfects, it does not destroy nature.
yeah. Well,
Thomas.
it's interesting too because that's one of the terms that I'm also hearing now, big on top of the post-war consensus, is grace doesn't destroy nature. But I liked how you made reference. I just got the book in front of me. In your preface, you said, beware iconoclasm. And you go on to say it's a heresy born of the fantasy that we can eliminate the possibility of idolatry by destroying every object of love other than the highest, which is God. And you quote Thomas Aquinas taught that grace perfects nature, it does not destroy it. And it's interesting too because I see other Christians who I know they believe that icons are bad, like you can't have icons of Christ and the saints, and that's idolatrous. So me as a Wesleyan, I don't venerate them, but what I'm getting at is that I see people misusing this quote. But as you're right to point out, that should mean then too we should be aware of iconoclasm, which is somewhat connected to this because it thinks that this view of grace, destroys nature, where the physical is kind of something that we shouldn't really touch or, tamper with, and we should just be these men who are kind of maybe tucked away, not really loving our nations, not really loving, the duties that we are endowed with by God.
Yeah, I think the post-war consensus recognized that German nationalism, Japanese militarism, communism, that these involved making an idol of the nation or making an idol of one's own people, the blood and soil, or treating the leader as a kind of godlike figure. And so the impulse was then to destroy the possibility of idolatry, and that's iconoclasm. And iconoclasm is a vice. In other words, idolatry is a vice. It's a supreme vice in the Old Testament. It's the great disaster that befalls the people of Israel again and again and again and again. Um, but you know, you the iconoclasm is that you're going to destroy the temple in Jerusalem so no one gets any wrong ideas about the worship of the one true God.
Mm.
Um, or, there was a great controversy in the ninth century in Eastern Christianity, the iconoclasm controversy. And essentially, it comes down to an, a denial of the incarnation, that any physical representation of our Lord is a dangerous temptation to idolatry. But if that's the case, then the mere fact that God became man is a sort of divine temptation of us.
Yeah.
So you can see that every age has its characteristic dangers. There are some ages that are tempted by idolatry. Other ages are tempted by iconoclasm. So I ask you, Lucas, you live and move in our postmodern, post-Christian, secular American society. Are people overwrought with passionate commitments, or are they languid with despair, cynicism, and a kind of consumer mentality that doesn't really motivate them to do anything noble and grand?
The latter, definitely.
That's
It's
a society that suffers from iconoclasm.
Yeah, you know what? Now that you're saying this, I see how that ties in because as you mentioned, when you use the term post-war consensus, you pointed out how that you probably would have signed on to some of those things as well. So it's not as if everything is bad. It sounds like, but your point with iconoclasm is it's afraid of committing idolatry, where the post-war consensus is afraid of repeating the horrors of World War II, and seen as in the Holocaust. And so it's this overreaction to it, where iconoclasm does the same thing. It doesn't want to break and make idols of creation, so it just gets rid of all icons of Christ. And so you're trying to say is that we don't have to really worry and go to this extreme, which is what many people are doing due to the histories of what happened 80 years ago.
Well, the very simple way I put it, if you've been through this orgy of violence and you want to try to organize society to make war less likely, so one obvious syllogism is if nothing is worth fighting for, nobody will fight. So we have to organize society so that no one believes there's anything worth fighting for.
Hmm.
And how do you do that? You critique, you debunk, you unmask, you show that everything that looks noble is in fact base. Everything that looks like it's worthy of loyalty is actually mired in racism or patriarchy or what have you. So if you just think back to your university education, almost all the pedagogy is a pedagogy oriented towards making you skeptical of any claim on your heart. And, you know, to a certain extent, they have succeeded. We know from polling data in Europe that in most European countries, young people, by large majorities, say they would not fight for their country.
Hmm.
Nothing is worth fighting for, nobody will fight. So it can, in some sense, succeed, at least for a while. But at what cost to the human condition? And you if there's nothing worth fighting for, then you've driven out any possibility of nobility. Because a noble soul is willing to sacrifice for the sake of something higher
Hmm.
than himself. Uh, and certainly, one sign of nobility is the willingness to protect the weak.
Hmm.
And, if nothing's worth fighting for, then one thing that's not worth fighting for are the weak and the vulnerable.
Yeah.
So, I just think that the flatness and the lassitude, there's in the seven deadly sins, pride, lust, greed. One of them is sloth. And sloth in English, we think it just means laziness. But the Greek word where the English word is, the Greek word is achadia, which means without care. And it really refers to the state of the soul when we don't care about anything. It really means it's more like depression than it is like laziness, this sloth. And I think that is the vice of our time, is that people despair of there being anything worth um, striving towards.
Hmm.
Uh, and they try to have careers and all that kind of stuff, but what is their goal? I mean, the whole language of safe spaces, um, and security, safety. Safety is protection. Protection is itself, that's not a very high ambition. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I would not want to be unsafe, but I'm willing to be unsafe in the pursuit of. I used to, I still go rock climbing, but I was very avid when I was younger, and it
Hmm.
involved risk. Why take a risk? We take a risk because there's something that you really care about more. Uh, Even marriage. Marriage is a risk. Not,
Yeah.
but let me put that, especially marriage is a risk. As I've often said to my young friends, getting married to the right person is the best possible choice. But of course, the danger is, how
You
do you know
don't.
it's the right person? But
Yeah.
nothing ventured, nothing gained. You
Yeah.
don't take that risk, you're
Yeah.
not going to have the opportunity of the blessing. Uh, so, so I think we see this throughout our society, and it's this achadia, this lack of care, um, this lack of passion. I think it's a fruit or a consequence of the post-war consensus. Again, if nothing's worth fighting for, no one will fight. Uh, if nothing is worth hoping for, then no one will be disappointed,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Hope, if you don't want any grand or noble achievements, you'll never be disappointed for not getting them.
Hmm.
One way of lowering the pain of uh, so partly it has to do with the post-war context, but also there's a therapeutic element to this that ties in the 1950s that I talk about. And this therapeutic element wants to drive unhappiness out of life, or the risk of unhappiness. But every grand venture runs the risk of failure.
Well, and it seems like too. So, just going back, to what you said earlier, how some things, or I don't know if you said that exactly, but it sounded like maybe that, again, as you mentioned, you probably would have got on board with a post-war consensus. It sounds like they got some things right, like we shouldn't be totalitarian, we shouldn't be racist. But do you think nowadays, though, people they're not, again, like the left, they use World War II to try to say anybody who disagrees with them is a fascist. Do you think in the beginning, then they were being genuine about this? Like this was good to not want.
Well, they're still being genuine.
Just oh, okay. Yeah, that was my question. Do you think they're
I
being
don't think
genuine?
they're being hypocritical. I think they sincerely believe that anybody who dissents from sort of the DEI, I mean, diversity, equity, inclusion. These
Yeah.
are these are these are open society motifs. In other words, even to say that something is normal is a threat to the open society. Um, Karl Popper's book Open Society and Its Enemies. It's a very telling title. That book was published in 1944. I read it in grad school in the 1980s and found it very, very engaging, and I was very affirmative. I reread it to write this book in 2017, 2018. I was kind of horrified because, in essence, Popper says that Plato is Plato, the philosopher, is a totalitarian thinker.
Hmm.
And you think about it, basically, the Western tradition of philosophy has its origins in Plato. So, what he's saying is the Western tradition is latently totalitarian.
It sounds like
So,
CRT.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly like CRT.
Everything's wrong in the West.
Everything's wrong in the West. And he argues that a strong view of truth is going to lead you down the path of totalitarianism. And so we get a kind of critical thinking and all these sorts of all this kind of rhetoric to weaken truth, so that people don't get all passionate, and they're just more docile and they'll move into their professional slot in the machine.
Hmm. Now, how do you think this is weakening? And what's your prediction for where? Because at the front of the book, you have nationalism, populism, and the future of the West. So,
Kind of grandiose, don't you think?
yeah, it is. I mean, great. Yeah, great title cover. Everything's
Well,
great about the book.
that's what book editors are for.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the whole thing is just an eye catcher. Honestly, like I just wanted to read this book just by the cover and the title.
Yeah, I love the cover. That cover photograph is a statue from the Valley of the Fallen, which is
Okay.
the monument to those who died in the Spanish Civil War that Franco had constructed in the
Ah.
1960s, I think.
Okay.
Um, and I think it says patriotism, right?
Yeah, on the
Patriotismo.
bottom of it. Yeah, you got the patriotism right there.
Patriotismo. Yeah,
Yeah,
and the I'm not an anti-Franco guy. Um,
'cause he was
I'm
a
glad.
fascist, right? Was that is that correct?
Well, yes, I mean he was,
Or a form of it?
but yes, he was the dictator of Spain from the late 1930s until his death in the early 1970s, and he was the triumphed in the Spanish Civil War against the communist and anarchist forces. I mean, I would have supported Franco in Spain in the 1930s.
Hmm.
I only say to myself what Evelyn Waugh said, that he said in the 1930s during the Spanish Civil War, that it is mischievous to say that as an Englishman, I must choose between communism and fascism. Uh, and I feel the same way. I'm very grateful to live in a country with liberal traditions such that I don't need to choose between fascism and communism.
Yeah.
And again, I do not think that uh, liberal people with university degrees may get their underwear in a bunch over some fascist threat, authoritarian threat. But I guarantee you, the people who voted for Donald Trump haven't any desire or impulse in the direction of fascism. If anything, there's a kind of "don't tread on me," sort of get the government out of my life mentality. That's a strong element of the Trump support, as well as frustrations with elite condescension and contempt for their lives, and then obviously a frustration with the way in which the globalized economy has disenfranchised economically large sectors of our society. And I talk about in the book, well, economic globalization. I quote George H.W. Bush,
I remember that. Yeah.
his 1990 speech to the United Nations about how, as the Soviet Union was collapsing and communism was dying in Eastern Europe, he envisioned a future of open borders, open trade, and most importantly of all, open minds.
Hmm.
And I think that epitomized the post war consensus, this belief that openness will always make things better, bring a world of peace and prosperity and broader flourishing among all citizens. Then we get to 2016 in the United States, and a growing number of people feel like the open borders and the open trade has actually been harmful to them, not helpful. Um, and then the open minds thing, uh, transgender ideology, ever more inclusive. There's a hostility to normal because normal is by definition a judgment, right? It's
Hmm.
about the center. And in an open society, there should be no center.
Hmm. Yeah.
Every
Good point.
everybody everybody should be equally kind of belonging. No one can belong more. Roger Scruton helped me see in a years ago, a decade ago or more ago, that um, kind of the egalitarian impulse can become very disordered. And why should a person who lives in New York City, a young person, 16, 17, 18 years old, who came to this country 2 or 3 years ago, whose English is not very good, and whose knowledge of American history and the Western tradition is minimal, why should that person have a lesser say in the future of our country than do you and I? And how do we ensure that he has an equal say?
Hmm.
Well, one way is to make sure that Lucas, that you are culturally ignorant. So, I mean, the equalities are kind of leveling down. Everyone is equally ignorant of the history of the United States and Western civilization, which is kind of where we are increasingly there. You know,
Yeah.
it's not like people going to university are stupid. It's not like they don't learn things. What they learn is technical and quasi scientific. It's not cultural. And Roger Scruton helped me see that that's a necessity, that kind of ignorance, that sort of planned ignorance, so that everybody can be equal footing
Hmm.
um, in their role in shaping the future.
Do you think people are waking up to, or the post-war consensus is fading due to kind of the George W. Bush implementations of its practices? Like basically, like we've seen where it's taken us and it just doesn't work. Do you think that's a factor, or do you think it's also spiritual as well, or maybe both?
There's when in the book I quote Richard Weaver. Richard Weaver was he was a literary scholar, but also a philosopher, a cultural critic. He wrote a book in the 1950s called Ideas Have Consequences, kind of a famous
Okay,
book.
yeah, I remember that quote.
And the quote is that every man has specific beliefs, general principles, and metaphysical dreams. And the metaphysical dreams really have to do with our overall sense of what is for the best and what is for the worst. And the open society consensus, the post war consensus, sees openness as the kind of metaphysical fluidity, openness. Heraclitus was a philosopher, a so-called pre-Socratic philosopher before Socrates, and his famous line is "All is flux." And and the metaphysical dream of the post-war consensus is that flux liberates. And
Kind of like fluid, right? Like flux is kind of like,
the more things are fluid, the more things
yeah.
are open, and everything can move without friction, the better things will be. And then uh, there was another pre-Socratic philosopher, Parmenides, and Parmenides urged us to cling to that which is and cannot not be. That is to say, permanence, unchangeableness. That is what we should seek, not fluidity, but the unchanging. And so those two things are kind of rivals for our affection.
Hmm.
And the post war consensus really emphasized the fluid. Um, and gender fluidity, divorce, cohabitation, kind of relationship fluidity, uh, global trade, economic fluidity. So if you look at all these things, the border, I often say that if you tell me what your position is on the enforcement of the southern border, I will tell you what your position is on transgenderism.
That's probably accurate, right? Because there's a correlation between those two groups of people.
And it's not, it has to do with the metaphysical dream.
Hmm.
It has to do with this metaphysical dream that if we can reduce boundaries and borders and allow things to move fluidly, that human beings will be happier. Um, but we know that mental health for young people is in the toilet. Uh, you know, there's a lot of unhappiness and dissatisfaction out there. It's easy to say that it has to do with the fact that people your age can't afford a home,
It's
buy a
true.
house,
Yeah.
which is certainly true. It could be that people your age are pessimistic about climate change. And certainly that's true. It could be that you're concerned that there'll be no Social Security left when you get to retirement age. All those things are economic, material factors, and I do not want to discount them. They're very important. But there's also a spiritual element. No father at home, no father in heaven.
Hmm.
And you
Yes.
ask yourself, are we surprised that mental health is in the toilet? I mean, how can people live without a sense of having a home? And a home, a national home, a domestic home, a family home, or most important of all, an eternal home where you can rest.
Yeah,
And
and they taught us to yeah, and to your point, like they've been teaching us to not love these things, to not love our home, not love our nation, not love ourselves. Especially if you're white, you can't love yourself because you're guilty, you're responsible for
yes,
past crimes, and this is something that you need to just repent for because of corporate guilt. And you're right, a lot of people are very, very unhappy.
well, it gets kind of exhausting. No solid place to stand. No home. Home is an important thing. Uh, there's that great gospel song. I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger. Uh, you know, uh, Heading over Jordan to my true home.
Yeah,
And I think as Christians, we need to, again, we're back to those earlier part of the conversation where Jesus warns us that we have to give up our natural loves. And we have to be, I think, of two minds. I mean, St. Paul or Jesus himself, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. In other words, don't shortchange the natural realities of our temporal life, even as you remember that you should only render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Uh,
yeah.
and don't overinvest. But we're back to idolatry and iconoclasm. Don't overinvest, but also don't underinvest.
Mm. On that note, I do have a question for you because I think I know what you're saying, but being that I have the author in front of me, and it's a really good point. So you say on page 153, to your point of going back to iconoclasm, overcorrection. It sounds like you're saying this, and I'll just read the quote and then ask if you can confirm. You said on page 153, the last paragraph, the perverse gods of blood, soil, and identity cannot be overcome with the open society therapies of weakening. On the contrary, they are encouraged by multiculturalism and the reductive techniques of critique. And then you go on to say, false loves can be remedied only by true ones. So it sounds like you're saying, like, there's an overcorrection where we could go towards, like, even for us, maybe somebody say, okay, the post-war consensus is a problem, but they can then go down the false path of the perverse god instead of the strong gods. The perverse gods would be gods of blood and soil. So
The
is
dark
that
gods,
is
like,
that what you're communicating? Like you'll be aware of the overcorrection.
yes, I mean the dark gods that come from below. I speak of. Uh, if we're made to love, then the therapy of lovelessness will ultimately fail, and we will find things to love, and they can be very perverse things.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
what I've learned from the book of Proverbs, at the opening of the book of Proverbs, uh, Lady Wisdom, she's out there trying to convince the men of the city not to keep their concubines and chase after the prostitutes. Concubines and prostitutes being metaphors for idolatry, and in other words, not abandoning themselves to to these to these loves at the expense of the truth. Um, but she fails. If you recall those first 8 chapters of the book of Proverbs, it's a long extended allegory. She fails, and they persevere in their false loves. And then she retreats to her house, and she organizes a banquet, and she sends her beautiful servant girls to the street corners to bring the men of the city in.
Hmm.
The message there is that only true loves are the only lasting protection against false and debasing loves.
Well, because it's interesting too, and I forgot to mention this, because you also say in the same section, in its present decadent form, the post-war consensus makes white nationalism an entirely cogent position. Basically, sounds like again, you're saying that weakening people can cause people to actually to go down the monster route in a sense. You know,
Correct.
yeah, like example I
You-
like to give
I
where
mean,
it's
if
like,
you went around spending all your time talking about race, critical race theory, race, you're just sort of planting the seeds in the
mm,
mind of a 18-year-old white guy that's sick and tired of being told he's the source of all evil in the world, that whiteness is the source of all goodness, which is, of course, as absurd as believing it's the source of all evil. Uh, and to my point is that, you know, as Ross Douthat said, if you think Christian nationalism is bad, wait till you find out what post-Christian nationalism looks like.
ooh,
Because we as men and women of faith, we recognize that we have to follow our Lord, who gives very clear commandments about how to treat others, and so it that love, our love of Christ, will protect us from these false loves in a way that critique doesn't. I mean, critique can just it can only, at the best, it can sort of uh, it's a herbicide to attack the weeds, but it has no power to actually grow the grain. So there's no harvest to be had in the open society consensus. Um, and that's where we come to. I think politically, populism, of course, it has economic sources, and people are tired of forever wars and all that kind of stuff. But they're also hungry for affirmation, and not of themselves. They're hungry to be able to have permission to affirm the things that are noble and worthwhile. Uh, it's funny. I was in 2016. I was in a car going to JFK, and the
mm,
driver was a Jewish guy from Baku, Azerbaijan.
that's a mouthful.
And and I and I said, "What are you going to vote for?" Because the primaries were coming up in New York, and he said, "Trump." And I said, "What are you
Right.
talking about? Isn't he anti-immigrant?" The guy spoke with a thick accent,
Mm,
and he said, "Oh, I don't want my daughters to grow up in a country that doesn't get respected."
ooh,
What he
good
was
point.
saying here is that I want my daughters to grow up in a country that they love and that they love.
Good dad. Yeah.
It was giving him permission. He was confident that Trump would make that possible. Now, you know, uh, yeah, I mean, and it wasn't all that complicated. It wasn't like Hillary Clinton was unpatriotic, or Kamala Harris is not patriotic, or Joe Biden is not patriotic. They're patriotic in their own way, but they're a little bit embarrassed by it.
Oh yeah, definitely.
That's what the post-war consensus tells us to be. Nationalism is the great, you know, destroyer of human life. Uh, but again, it's not 1939. It's 2024. And you go to the Ohio River Valley, and you would think we had just lost a major war with all the kind of social, literal. You go to Steubenville, Ohio, I mean, 2/3 of the downtown has been demolished,
Mm,
as there's vacant lots everywhere. And so, it's the open society consensus that has it's the effects of that globalization, broadly understood, um, and then the 100,000 people a year dying of drug overdose death in the United States. Uh, you know, that's not that's not that's not nationalism talking. That's despair based in a world where, as I said, no father at home, no father in heaven, uh,
Yeah.
no belonging, no home, no purpose, no meaning.
Yeah. One of the things that I noticed too with this term that's being popularized now by you, post-war consensus, is that some people, and I don't know if you come in contact with this, but some people want to use this term as a way to reinterpret World War II, where maybe Churchill was the main villain of World War II, not Hitler, and they want to level the playing fields. But I noticed that you spoke not so much, but you mentioned the Holocaust. So you're still not somebody who's trying to come along and say both sides were evil morally on the same level. And this is really what the post-war consensus means. When I talk to you, you're just saying that some things were good, but then there was this overcorrection, and that basically our affections are out of order. We have to remedy, and actually, these right-ordered affections would remedy us from white nationalism. Is that fair?
Yes, if I succeed and we reorder our society towards, if you will, a love society rather than the open society, um, I guarantee you my grandchildren will be cursing me because of the consequences.
Yeah.
You know, beware the illusion that you can solve the problem of original sin. Uh, you know, the you can understand how someone who's 40 years old and looks at the rhetoric about fascism and Hitler that is bandied about here and says, this is crazy. And then does historical research and wants to come up with some thesis that basically counteracts the dominant narrative about the good guys and the bad guys in World
Yeah.
War II. I understand that. I think it's just a wrong approach uh, to it. Um, I mean, my grandfather fought in World War II and was an
Mhm.
officer, an artillery officer,
Wow.
and liberated a concentration camp. I don't think he had any doubts about who the bad guys were.
And he wasn't the villain too. We call him the greatest generation for a reason as
Yeah, but
well.
I think yes, I buy. I think that the every myth is an element of our historical imagination. We have many myths about World War II. Um, there's no reason not to examine those myths.
Hmm.
And Churchill as a villain. You know, in 1940, after Dunkirk, uh, there were powerful elements in the British cabinet that wanted to make a deal with Hitler, and Hitler, of course, being Churchill, of course, prevailed. Um, but who was the loser? Did Great Britain win World War II? Uh, I mean, in some ways, they've never recovered. Um,
Yeah.
such is the providence of God. I think to to there's a kind of rising and falling of imperial power, and our power was waxing and theirs was waning. And the end of the war decisively shifted the balance of imperial power to the United States.
Hmm.
And who knows where we will be, you know, in a decade's time. I mean, I certainly hope that the Trump administration will moderate the more extreme ambitions of the American empire so that we can sustain and maintain a kind of reasonable role as leader in the global context.
Yeah.
But I fear that we've overextended ourselves in the last 2 decades, partly because the post war consensus imbued us with this kind of uh, quasi religious purpose to bring the post war consensus to the entire world.
Oh, yeah, it's globalism, which is a big agenda. I mean, probably the number one agenda that we've seen from the left in these last couple of years, especially, where this is big push. As you said, instead of closed borders, it's open borders, and that tantamounts to everything, even ethically as well. In regards to transgenderism, if the border can be open, it's because I believe gender can be open, and that's a great point because they're really just projecting what they feel about themselves and how they should live onto everything.
It's a metaphysical dream that
Yeah,
just make the world a better place.
yeah.
And you and I look with horror on that and think the world will not be a better place. It will be no place. Nobody will have a place. Everyone will be in this state of constant reinvention of oneself. It seems exhausting to me. And
Yeah,
also, you know, the place, I mean, these to have a home is to have people who care about you as who you are. The danger of the post-war consensus liquefies everything, and then the powerful turn everybody else into raw material for their own projects.
hmm.
And I think it opens the door to a kind of ugly form of kind of Nietzschean domination. Um, and yeah, so far from fascism, I think that um, those of us who want to bring the 20th century to an end, set aside the post war consensus, or nurture these unifying loves in our society, far from being fascists, I think uh, we're the ones who want to set up the guardrails and prevent kind of rapacious world in which the winners win and the losers lose.
Do you think within one generation we'll be past this, or do you think it's to be a bit longer, or maybe a little bit sooner? Sooner?
I think things are changing rapidly. Uh, I think one of the striking aspects of the recent campaign cycle is that, you know, the liberal establishment was like a machine gun firing accusations of fascism and Hitler and all that kind of stuff. And it turns out they're shooting blanks.
Now, yeah, praise God.
And the majority of voters were indifferent to those accusations. Um, and why is that the case? I mean, part of it is it's meaningless to many people. You know, when Franklin Roosevelt ran against Herbert Hoover in 1932, the Civil War was closer to that election than World War II is to the most recent election in years.
Hmm.
And in that election, nobody was talking about Jefferson Davis. No one's talking about Robert E. Lee. Um, so it's a sign that the mythology of World War II is just it's just gotten too old and overused and um, so I think we're reaching a point where, as I said, young people when I say post-war, they're kind of like what post what like post-Iraq war.
Well, yeah, I mean, they don't. I don't know what schools are teaching them nowadays, but they might not even have that far back as well.
But it's just natural. I mean, the Civil War, even though they weren't talking about it in 1932, Civil War influenced our political culture for about 100 years. Um, Civil rights movement, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill in 1965, he said, "We've lost the South for a generation." And what he meant by that is that, well, why is the South Democrat? Well, because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And, so that's 100 years. And about 10% of military age men died in the Civil War. That's catastrophic
Hmm.
numbers. And if you look at World War One and Two in the European context, you get a similar number of military age men being killed. And when that happens to a society, it's a deep trauma. And thankfully, American society was spared most of the destruction of World War Two. But Europe, that's not the case. So I fear that they have longer to go in this kind of spiritual desert uh, of the aftermath. I think the United States, I think this. I mean, Trump didn't just win; he won decisively.
Hmm.
All the swing states went for him, and he won the popular vote. And this against a really completely unified elite opposition to him. And that's an indication that our society is changing, and that the post war consensus is no longer able to compel um, loyalty. Um, will our universities correct course? Will the Democratic Party correct course? Um, I fear sometimes that they're, they may not, in which case we'll have more conflict. But my hope is that kind of smart people will say, what are the real problems facing our country? And,
Yeah.
now let's argue about how to solve them. Here's what gives me some hope. Uh, Harris and Trump, they competed with each other about who was going to give the most amount of money to women with children. That suggests that we have a bipartisan agreement. We got a kind of family problem in our country. So back to my point about, now you can't say no father at home equals a problem. That's still politically, the left will accuse you of um, uh, disvaluing non-traditional families and so on. But that's a start. We got a problem.
Hmm.
Uh, both Biden did not uh, uh, suspend the tariffs that Trump imposed on China. There's a complete agreement on both parties that we're going to have to deal with China, face China.
Hmm.
That suggests a shift in the direction of accepting kind of national loyalty as important. Uh, the Tammy Duckworth, Sherrod Brown, Bob Casey, that these swing state senators started running ads saying that they agreed with Trump about immigration.
Hmm.
Maybe there's an appetite in the Democratic Party to recognize that the whole open borders thing is just it's just so destructive. So I am an American optimist, as you can see.
Yeah.
I look at these as signs that our elite are willing to make adjustments. And if they are, I think we can reconsolidate as a country around a left right consensus that where the left and the right, they argue about how to deal with it, but they agree what the problem is. The problem is that the postmodern West is disintegrating, and we have to shore up the fundamental foundations for people's lives: faith, family, and flag. Those are the three F's that I call them.
Amen. The return of the strong gods. Yeah, thanks so much for being with us. Are there any final words you want to leave us with? I mean, I know there was an epic outro. It was like I didn't have to ask you; you just gave it.
Yes, there we go. Well, one of the things I end the book with is a counsel against despair. It's very easy, I think. It just seems, everything seems so broken, and people can be very despairing. Conservatives, especially, can be kind of despairing. I mean, things are pretty broken. I mean,
Oh yeah, definitely.
I just want to remind people that ever since the fall of man, things have been broken. And that I quote Alexander Solzhenitsyn at the end of the book, that progress we should see as a challenge by God, an infinitely intricate test of our free will. How do we respond to the problems that our age presents? And the same thing is true for regress as well as for progress. So let's just let's all just try to go out and try to actually do what we can to make things better,
Mhm.
uh, and leave the ultimate fate of things in God's hands.
Amen. Well, Rusty, thank you so much for joining us. And to the viewers, like this video, and I'll leave his book in the description of this video so you can purchase on Amazon. And I will say, by the way, it was a fun book to read. It was easy as well. So, I definitely commend you for making a great work on your part.
Thank you.
My pleasure. All right, guys. Again, please like this video. It helps the algorithm push it out. Subscribe to Method Ministries. Take care. Thanks for tuning in. We're signing off, and God bless.